Well, what a nice turnout. This is great. Thank you for coming out here tonight. Yeah. So welcome to the first program of what's going to be an extraordinary season of Northwestern Michigan College International Affairs Forum. Before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, this would be a marvelous time to silence your cell phones. We'd like to recognize Mercantile Bank for sponsoring this program, and we thank them because their support is absolutely critical. And we greatly appreciate those who are joining us in person, as well as those of you from across the globe who make up our live stream audience. It is your membership that makes these programs possible. There's going to be an opportunity for questions later in the program. And to remind you how we did it last year, we're going to be distributing cards, and they'll be gathered later. We'll get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. And if you're a student, please write student at the top of your card, and no cheating. Some of the last year, some of you folks have been writing student, so you get your question asked first. We want all of your voices heard and your questions answered. We also recognize that this is an emotional topic, and with decent people that we need. In December, we presented a program with from the Palestinian and Israeli perspectives. Much has happened since December, and a one-hour format is insufficient to cover all viewpoints. So if you happen to be someone who feels that your voice isn't represented, send us recommendations for a speaker for a future IAF program. We are committed to the free exchange of ideas without trying to drown out the other side. Now it is my privilege to welcome our featured speaker and our moderator. Khaled Elgindy is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he also directs the Middle Eastern Institute's program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He is the author of the newly released book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians, From Balfour to Trump, published by Brookings Institution Press. He previously served as a fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution from 2010 through 2018. Prior to arriving at the Brookings, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009, and was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 and 2008. He is also an adjunct instructor in Arab studies at Georgetown University. Khaled's writings have appeared in a wide range of publications, including the Christian Science Monitor, CNN, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the Los Angeles Times, the National Interest, the Washington Quarterly, and others. He is frequently quoted as a recognized expert on Palestine and Israel, and he is a regular commentator on TV and radio, including Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, NPR, PBS NewsHour, and others. Khaled is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he also directs their program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He holds a BA in political science from Indiana University, Bloomington, and an MA in Arab studies from Georgetown University. He is fluent in English and Arabic. Our moderator is our own Dr. John Zachman. Dr. Zachman is a professor in political science and philosophy departments at Northwestern Michigan College. He holds a BA from Michigan State University and a PhD from Duke University. At NMC, he teaches moral and ethical philosophy and political science courses in a variety of disciplines. He has been promoting student and community engagement in world affairs for over 2 decades at NMC. Now, audience, please join me in welcoming Khaled Elgindy to the IAF stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for your very gracious reception of me here. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm honored, actually, to see so many of you. This is my first time in Traverse City, and it's beautiful. I wish I could stay longer, and I'm sorry that I can't. So I'm going to go ahead and start. And a disclaimer I'm just going to set up my timer here because I have a bad habit of not sticking to the time. A disclaimer, some of the things that I'm going to be saying tonight are going to be difficult to hear, may even make some of you uncomfortable, and that's okay. And it's hopefully will still be an opportunity for us to have an exchange of ideas. So, where's the clicker? Yeah. Before getting into the topic, and I'm going to talk a little bit about October 7th and what's happened since October 7th and why we don't have a ceasefire, I thought it'd be useful just to have some context. The situation before October 7th, because we often hear that, well, there was a ceasefire in place on October 6th. It's not the case that there was a ceasefire on October 6th. It's a talking point. But just to illustrate the point, I want to give you a sense of what the 15 years before October 6th looked like. In that 15-year period from 2008 until October 6, 2023, the total number of Israelis killed in conflict with Palestinians, right? I'm talking about political violence. I'm not talking about car accidents or murders. This is in the context of Israel-Palestine conflict. Total number of Israelis killed 310. Half of that number are soldiers. Roughly half of them are soldiers in the course of the many wars in Gaza over that time period, in 2009, 12, 2014, 2021, 2022. By comparison, in that same period of 15 years, more than 20 times as many Palestinians were killed. Again, most of these are in the context of Gaza. So the many Gaza wars, 2009, for example, something like 1,200 Palestinians were killed. In 2014 was like 2,300. So about 6,400 killed. So when people say there was no ceasefire or there was a ceasefire in place on October 6th, what they really mean is that Israelis felt safe on October 6th. Palestinians did not feel safe. The status quo was quite painful for Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, because Gaza had been under a blockade for 17 years. And of course, Israel's occupation has lasted for 56 years. And in fact, most of Gaza's population are refugees descended from people who were dispossessed from their homes and villages during Israel's creation in 1948. This is part of the context. Okay, so October 7th. October 7th for Israelis was the deadliest day in Israel's history, right? You saw that number, 310 killed in 15 years, 4 times as many Israelis killed in a single day, right? Devastating. Many killed in really brutal, horrific ways. A national trauma, for sure, in addition to the individual families who were directly affected, either killed or injured, or among the 250 or so who were taken hostage back to Gaza. This is a collective trauma that we have to acknowledge that Israelis endured and that they continue to endure, if only because of the hostages that remain. For Palestinians, everything since October 7th, it's hard even to encapsulate in words, but for Palestinians, the period since October 7th, it has been the deadliest single moment in Palestinian history, the largest forced displacement in Palestinian history. Again, this is a people whose history is one of dispossession and displacement. In the wake of October 7th, Israeli leaders declared that there were no innocents in Gaza. I'm quoting now the Israeli president, Michael Herzog. And they vowed to flatten Gaza. These are the words that they used. We will flatten Gaza. We will turn Gaza into a city of tents, all of which actually came to pass. And in fact, on October 9th, 2 days after the terrorist attacks of October 7th, Israel's defense minister said openly, we are cutting off all electricity. He said, no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly. This is exactly how Israel has acted over the last almost 1 year now. Civilians have been killed in record numbers. More children have been killed in Gaza in the first 3 months of this war than in all of the conflicts in the world combined for any single year in recent memory. That's just in the first 3 months. More journalists have been killed, about 140 or so in Gaza, than any other conflict. More aid workers, about 280, than any other conflict. The scale of destruction in Gaza is unprecedented. About 80,000 tons of bombs, more than all of the tons of bombs dropped on Dresden, Hamburg, and London during World War II combined, have been dropped on tiny little Gaza. The equivalent, roughly the equivalent of 3 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima. Not surprisingly, Gaza is a densely populated place. We see massive death, at least 40,000 that we know of killed. The numbers are probably much higher. Almost all of Gaza's hospitals have been destroyed. All of Gaza's universities have been destroyed. 70% of Gaza's homes have been destroyed. In addition, Gaza is suffering from mass starvation and disease. 1.1 million, about half of Gaza's population, are on the verge of famine. Northern Gaza is already in famine. Dozens of children have died of malnutrition. According to Oxfam, Gaza is the fastest rate of starvation in history. The famine in Gaza is, most recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, we actually have one of those, a man by the name of Michael Fakhri, and I'm quoting his recent report, never in post-war, meaning post-World War II, never in post-war history had a population been made to go hungry so quickly and so completely as was the case for the 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza. The famine in Gaza is not only man-made, it is a function of Israeli policy. Groups like Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, Save the Children, the World Food Program, have all said that Israel is clearly using starvation as a weapon of war. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said the same thing, as has EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, as well as a number of US senators who visited the region. In short, Gaza is being rendered uninhabitable. Gaza as a society has effectively been destroyed. This is why many scholars, particularly scholars of genocide, are calling it a genocide. Within a week of the start of this war, so intensive and so massive was the scale of destruction, Dr. Raz Siegel, who is himself Jewish and Israeli, an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University, he wrote an article called A Textbook Case of Genocide. Since then, of course, the International Court of Justice has taken up the issue and has essentially, in a case brought forth by South Africa, has essentially indicted Israel on the charge of genocide. Of course, it hasn't been adjudicated. It will take many years. But they have agreed to hear the case, and essentially they've determined that there is cause to be concerned and have issued preliminary measures incumbent on Israel to mitigate the threat of genocide. Genocide, for those who don't know, under the Genocide Convention, again, this isn't hyperbole, this isn't a slur. The Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So, also you can see on the, I don't have time to talk about the situation in the West Bank, but Israel is in many ways exporting the tactics, the measures used in Gaza into the West Bank. They're besieging hospitals, they're destroying infrastructure, destroying shops and towns, particularly in the north. Right now, the West Bank is going through the most violent period at the hands of the Israeli army in 22 years, since the beginning of the second Palestinian uprising. So why isn't there a ceasefire? Oh, by the way, the map that you see here, this is a map of the Gaza Strip. The black are the population centers. The red represents bombed structures or areas. As you can see, almost all of Gaza City. Gaza was the largest Palestinian city, and today it has been effectively erased. There is no such thing anymore as Gaza City. And you can see the same thing in the center, in the city of Khan Yunis, and in the south, in Rafah. So almost all of Gaza has been destroyed. So it's been 3.5 months since President Biden laid out his ceasefire plan. And yet, today, US and other mediators have all but given up on the hope for a ceasefire. Why is that? Well, let's look at the calculations of each side. On the Israeli side, the Netanyahu government, which, by the way, is the most extreme government in Israel's history. And to illustrate for you what that means, we're not just talking about a right-wing Likud government, but there are elements in his government, Kahanists, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who hold very important positions. Who are these people? It's in the context, in an American context, they would be the equivalent of the KKK. So imagine a Republican administration in which the Attorney General was a card-carrying member of the Klan, and the Interior Secretary was a neo-Nazi. And I'm not, again, this isn't hyperbole. They are Jewish supremacists. In fact, Ben-Gvir himself has been convicted in an Israeli court of terrorist incitement. This is the kind of people who are shaping Israeli decision-making and policy. So, this government has stated, has laid out a number of objectives in Gaza. The first is to destroy Hamas, release the hostages, and prevent another October 7th attack from happening. Almost a full year later, they haven't achieved these goals. In fact, there is no real definitive achievement that they can point to that they can call a victory, much to their frustration. Hamas has not been defeated and certainly not eliminated. The very notion of destroying Hamas, I think, is nonsensical, right? You cannot destroy a political movement with bombs. Because it's about ideas, and you can only destroy ideas with better ideas, or at least challenge them. And at the end of the day, Israeli army has killed more of their own hostages than they've managed to rescue. And in fact, the only hostages who've been released, more than 100 back in November, were part of a diplomatic or political process. That's Israel on the one hand. On the other hand, there's Hamas. For Hamas, the number one priority is to survive, right? All Hamas has to do is to survive, which they've done. But for them to agree to a ceasefire, they need the ceasefire to be a permanent one, right? They're not going to agree. So Netanyahu is saying, we'll agree to a temporary stoppage in the fighting so we can get our hostages, and then we'll just go back and continue the war. That's not something that's not very appealing. The Hamas is going to give up the hostages in return for, just to have the war continue afterwards. So they've been demanding a permanent ceasefire. All right, so clearly the parties bear responsibility, but we also have to look at the role the United States has played as the single most influential actor in this whole process. So we can break down the U.S. role into 3 phases. Okay, in the first phase of the war, for the first few months, the Biden administration offered unconditional support in the same absolutist zero-sum terms that articulated by the Israeli government for the Israeli offensive, and all of the maximalist goals, while rejecting any calls for a ceasefire. The word ceasefire was a dirty word from October until at least February. The U.S. vetoed 3 separate ceasefire resolutions at the Security Council, and the Biden administration, I think this was the most dangerous thing that they did. They explicitly declared from the podium in the White House that there are no red lines with Israel in this war. Even though privately the administration was telling the Israelis, try to restrain yourselves, do something. Publicly they said there are no red lines. That was an extraordinarily reckless thing to say. No, there's no other US administration had ever done that before. By November, the administration had laid out their own day after vision. There would be no forcible displacement of the population in Gaza, no reoccupation of Gaza, no reduction in Gaza territory, and they wanted to see the Palestinian Authority eventually return to Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu has explicitly rejected all of these. In phase 2 of the war, from February to May, as the war dragged on, the U.S. expected the war, from what many of us in Washington heard from the administration, they were expecting the war to wrap up around end of January. That didn't happen. So as the war dragged on, the administration became more vocal in their frustration and in their discomfort with Israel's conduct. But the message remained very, very conflicted. So on the one hand, Biden would say things like, Israel's war is over the top, right? He would say, kind of mumbling under his breath, the indiscriminate bombing. All of which were accurate, of course, but at the same time, he was still fast-tracking the weapons to Israel to conduct this over-the-top indiscriminate bombing, and even bypassing Congress in several instances. This is also the period when we start to hear the standard refrain from the White House that Israel must do more to prevent civilian deaths. Far too many civilians have been killed. I think many of us who follow the issue, we have the talking points memorized. Israel must do more to allow humanitarian assistance. It's also when we started to see U.S. take these extraordinary steps like the airdrops. You remember when they were airdropping aid into Gaza because Israel was not allowing over the land borders enough aid to reach people. That was abandoned. And then there was also, you remember, the floating pier. The U.S. spent about $300 million on this floating pier idea that most technical experts were saying was absurd. Why would you have a floating pier that was susceptible to, the forces of the sea and other? When you have, Gaza has 6 land crossings, you could just bring food and medicine that way. But because those were controlled by Israel and the U.S. didn't want to use the leverage to force Israel to open them, it resorted to these extraordinary measures that they later had to abandon because they weren't practical. We even started hearing stark warnings from the administration. Many of you may remember after there was a moment when Israeli airstrikes targeted a convoy from the World Central Kitchen, right? Repeatedly, many of their vehicles were targeted and killed them. It was a huge PR nightmare for the administration and for the Israelis. Secretary Blinken at the time issued a very stark warning. He said, either Israel changes its conduct or the U.S. will change its policy, right? So now we're on a path toward the policy has to change. There has to be something has to give, right? Well, there are 2 decisive moments that I think shed light on the U.S. role. The first was in April, the U.S. published a national security memo requiring assurances from all of its allies that received U.S. weapons that those weapons were being used in accordance with both U.S. law and with international humanitarian law. That is the laws of war, okay? And so the U.S. issued this memo and everyone thought, oh, that's because they're going to they're going to hold Israel accountable for how they use US weapons. And the second was, after Israel had already destroyed the two main cities, Gaza City in the north and Khan Yunis in the south, the administration said, warned the Israelis, do not go further south. Remember, most of the population had been pushed to the south, concentrated around Rafah. They said, you can't go to the south. And Biden even declared Rafah would be a red line for the administration. And even announced that they were withholding some bombs from Israel, namely the 2,000-pound bombs and 500-pound bombs. So what happened? Well, with the National Security Memo, the U.S. issued its report on Israel's compliance. They got assurances. The Israelis said, we're totally compliant with your laws, with international law, everything is cool. The U.S. said, yeah, you're probably right. The report doesn't say Israel doesn't commit violations of international law. They said, in fact, they probably are committing violations, but there's just not enough information to decide definitively, and therefore we don't need to cut off the funds, because under US law prohibits American weapons from being used to violate human rights. So here was the administration essentially letting Israel off the hook officially, even though they know, because every human rights organization in the world that has looked at this has determined quite emphatically that not only is Israel violating international humanitarian law, but doing so on a massive scale in the most egregious ways, right? The U.S. understands this. The U.S. has more intelligence than we do, than Human Rights Watch does, than anyone else does. But they insisted there's just not enough information. So through that loophole, they were allowed to continue the weapons. What happened with the Rafah red line? I think we all know what happened. The moment Netanyahu said, I'm calling your bluff, sent the army into Rafah, they invaded. What did the Biden administration do? They said, it's not really an invasion. They invaded Rafah. It's not really an invasion. So this is what Rafah looked like before the war, and this is what Rafah looked like after. It's, as a city, has been entirely erased. Not a single structure is left standing. So this is the invasion that wasn't an invasion. So since Netanyahu called Biden's bluff, the US has abandoned any overt attempt to change Israel's conduct, and instead has focused on getting a ceasefire deal, because the ceasefire deal will be the fastest and most effective way to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians, right? While continuing, again, to fast-track the weapons to Israel. What's the lesson that Netanyahu learned from this is that he can act with impunity. And so Netanyahu, I think most people understand, needs the war to continue for him to remain in power, because not only will he be held accountable for the failures of October 7th, but also he will lose his coalition, and by losing his coalition, he's going to end up in jail because he's facing criminal trial for corruption. So he desperately needs to stay in power. He needs the war to expand. He needs the war to continue and to expand. So he's constantly shifted the goalposts. First, it was, we absolutely have to take Rafah for the vital security, no question. After they took Rafah, they said, well, we absolutely have to control the Gaza border with Egypt, because that's where all the tunnels are, and it's the lifeline for Hamas's weapons, and we have to control. His own military people said, no, we don't need to control. So this was not part of the controlling the Rafah border. The border crossing was not part of the ceasefire proposal. So he feels comfortable in shifting the goalposts. Since then, we've seen a number of escalations with the border with Lebanon, assassinations of Hamas leaders, including Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated in the Iranian capital, new demands, as I mentioned, on the Rafah border crossing. and Israel now expanding the war into the West Bank. And most recently, in the last 2 days, I don't know what to call them, these mass pager assassination scheme. I mean, it's like a dystopian nightmare. I mean, what Israel is introducing into this realm of war, and frankly, this is not warfare, this is terrorism, is truly, truly frightening. All of it is intended to expand and escalate the war. Okay, so I'm going to sum up. The reasons there isn't a ceasefire is because the U.S. hasn't worked to alter the cost-benefit calculations of the parties, especially the most powerful party, Israel. So as long as Israel faces no costs to continuing the war, and in fact there are many benefits, especially to Netanyahu personally, Netanyahu has no incentive to go along with any ceasefire deal, right? Because the U.S. can always be counted on to deflect or absorb whatever costs emerge, right? In fact, this administration has been more focused on narrative management than on conflict management. Israel is always put in the best possible light. Hamas, of course, in the worst possible light, regardless of the facts. So when Hamas is the problem in a ceasefire, they will clearly say Hamas is the problem. They're the obstacle. And that was true maybe between May and July. But even when Hamas isn't the problem, they still say Hamas is the problem and Netanyahu, even when Netanyahu is the obstacle. When his own military people, his own defense minister is saying Netanyahu is the biggest obstacle to a ceasefire, even then they tell us, nope, it's still Hamas. It's all about creating a narrative and not about resolving a conflict. So what the U.S. should have been doing that they didn't do is they should have declared very early on that there is no military solution to this conflict. They should have said that from the very outset. True Israeli security can only come from a resolution of the root causes of this conflict, and that is the denial of Palestinian rights, the dispossession of Palestinians, the continued occupation of 5 million Palestinians with no rights, i.e. a political resolution. They also didn't lay down any clear red lines or guardrails, which they should have done on day one, both in terms of the conduct of the war and in terms of a post-war strategy. They allowed Israel to continue the war even though Israel had no day after plan. They had no strategy they had no exit strategy. They asked the Israelis for an exit strategy, but they never conditioned their continued support on having that exit strategy, just like they never conditioned it on Israel abiding by international law. They could have called out the obstructionist party, regardless of who it was, but they didn't. They could have insisted at a minimum on the application of U.S. law, and that is no weapons, U.S. weapons can be used for international law violations. So as it turns out, and this will be my concluding point, as it turns out, these very same dynamics also explain why the U.S. has not been an effective mediator between Israelis and Palestinians for the last 30 plus years. And this, in fact, this is the subject of my book, Blind Spot. Historically, the U.S. has always viewed Israel and Palestine through an Israeli lens. And so what that means is that certain things get filtered out. And usually those things are Palestinian things, like Palestinian politics, Palestinian political aspirations, Palestinian rights. But in light of the Biden administration, which I didn't even realize until when I wrote the book, it also applies to Palestinian humanity. That blind spot extends even to viewing Palestinians as human beings. So in any normal mediation, you look at the power dynamics between the two sides, and this is a vastly asymmetrical situation between Israelis and Palestinians, right? Israel is a nuclear power with a first world economy and high-tech weapons, and Palestinians have crude rockets and, guns and right, but not an army, certainly nothing on the scale of Israel. So Ideally, a mediator acknowledges the power asymmetry, the political dynamics between the parties, within the parties, and creates incentives and disincentives for dissuading behavior that perpetuates violence and incentivizing behavior that builds trust, for example. But that's not at all how the US has operated over the past 3 decades. In fact, US mediation is built on an entirely different set of assumptions. The first, which is sometimes in the Biden context is called the bear hug, right? That we have to hug Israel so hard so that they feel loved and secure. The first is that peace requires that Israel be reassured. That means no pressure on Israel. That means only positive incentives for Israel and an extraordinary deference and sensitivity to Israeli domestic politics and so on and so forth, right? This is, for Biden, this is what he calls the bear hug. The second principle is that peace, if Israelis need to be reassured, peace requires that Palestinians be reformed, right? Because Palestinians are defective, their politics are defective. We have to turn them into a suitable peace partner. They're not ready to be independent. That's what the 2 pillars of a US-led peace process have been built on. In essence, what the US ended up doing is reverse the standard model of mediation. Instead of putting pressure on the strong side, they put pressure on the weaker side, and no pressure on the stronger side. So the result was pretty predictable, and that is you deepen the power imbalance, and it's precisely that power asymmetry that perpetuates conflict, just like what we're seeing in this moment. That said, I will say that the Biden administration, in my mind, represents the blind spot, I think, in its most extreme and devastating form. And so I will end there. Thank you very much. Sorry.
I'm going to turn the mics on. Well, thank you very much, Khaled, for that wonderful overview of your take on what's going on in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. I guess I have a ton of questions. Most of them aren't my original questions that I typed up. So where to begin? I guess I'll start with the question of your critique of the Biden administration, and I guess I'm going to make an assumption, and clarify me if I'm wrong, but clearly you think that on ethical grounds the Biden administration is doing a terrible job and making a huge mistake. But I'm also going to assume that on strategic grounds, in terms of U.S. long-term interests, that you think the Biden administration is making a terrible mistake. And I would also submit that I think you probably have the same view of Israel, that they're making a terrible mistake in what they're doing. And I guess so, one, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the strategy of the United States right now, why it's making the mistakes that you see it making. The same thing with Israel as well. And I'll have a follow-up question concerning kind of Hamas's strategy, but why don't we start with the Biden administration and Israel?
Sure. You know, I think the problem is that the Biden administration doesn't have a strategy, at least not one that is discernible, because the policy is so muddled and incoherent. I mean, I get questions from reporters who ask me, like, can you make sense of this? Like, why are we doing this? Why does President Biden allow himself to be humiliated repeatedly by Benjamin Netanyahu? I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, that's like you have to get into the psychology of Joe Biden, and I don't know. Because honestly, to me, it defies, let's set aside the moral question of mass killing and destruction. From a geopolitical standpoint, is this good for the region? Is being on the brink of war between Israel and Lebanon, which will be catastrophic for both sides. Hezbollah is not Hamas. Israel hasn't been able to defeat Hamas in a full year. Hezbollah is much better equipped, much better armed, and they can do real damage to Israelis in Israel, unlike Hamas, which can't do much to Israelis, especially now. So is this a good thing? Is a possible war with Iran a good thing? No, and this is the one thing that the administration has spent a lot of energy in trying to prevent, right? So just the other day, Amos Hochstein, Blinken's envoy to Lebanon, trying to broker a deal to prevent Israel and Israel and Hezbollah from full-blown war, right? Because we know that Israel is preparing, the Israeli military has plans for a full-on invasion of Lebanon. The U.S. desperately wants to avoid that. So Amos Hochstein is there, and what happens while he's still on the ground in Israel? We have these bizarre pager cyber attack of thousands of people blowing up. The U.S. says we didn't know anything about it. That's a pretty scary prospect, that your number one ally is not sharing this information in a moment when you, as the United States, are trying to prevent this very thing from happening. The fact that they don't share it is really very telling about the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So what's the strategy from a geopolitical standpoint? There is no benefit to any of this. You've destabilized the region, and one thing that I don't think they fully appreciate is you've now added a layer to the Israel-Palestine conflict that didn't exist before, because now you have this destruction of Gaza that will be etched into the collective memory of Palestinians forever, like 1948 and like 1967. And so we've now perpetuated not only are they not resolving the conflict, they've now perpetuated it into the future for generations, right, because of this collective trauma. So it doesn't make any sense in geopolitical terms. It doesn't make any sense even in domestic political terms, because it was hurting Biden's reputation. It's hurting even Kamala Harris, and there's just there's no added value to continuing on this path. So I don't think they have a strategy. I think it's really about Biden's personal commitment to Israel that he feels deep down in his soul, and that after October 7th, and we know that he was deeply moved and affected by, and he felt the pain of Israelis, and I think it's very personal for him, and I think the idea of a strategy is secondary, but there's no analyst that I have met who would consider any aspect of this policy to represent a coherent policy, much less a strategy. So I think there's an ideological, personal commitment that Biden has to Israel, and all of the other things are secondary.
Do you think Netanyahu was banking on the Americans to support Israel in the near term, immediately after October 7th, because of the incredible devastation to the Israeli people at that point in time? And I mean, is this a question of the Biden administration not anticipating how this was going to go, right? Because I can see the Biden administration saying, well, certainly you have a right to defend yourself. This was a horrific attack, 1,200 dead, more than 200 hostages. Strategic targeting of Hamas infrastructure and locations is an entirely appropriate thing to do. I mean, when you think of 2001 and the attack on the United States on 9/11, we obviously felt a very strong need to go into Afghanistan at that point to get al-Qaeda. But what I'm getting at here is not that a continued endorsement would be necessary, but rather that to some extent, Israel's strategy there was, well, once we start this, the Americans are going to have to say yes for the first at least month or two. And then it seems to me that a strong criticism of the Biden administration would be to say, you didn't sense what was going on quickly enough and see that this was not simply collateral damage that was happening, because what you're describing going on in Gaza seems like it's much more than collateral damage in terms of legitimate military targets. and that the Biden administration was not at all what they needed to be as this developed in terms of pressuring Israel privately or publicly.
Yeah, I think Netanyahu sensed very early on that Biden is not going to criticize Israel. I mean, this has been his MO for even before October 7th, that he disagreed when he was vice president. He disagreed with President Obama when, criticizing Israel on things like Israeli settlements. He does not believe in publicly showing any daylight with Israel, even if he finds it, if he doesn't like what Israel's doing. These are things that have to be handled privately. And Netanyahu knows this. And in his view, as long as it's not public, it's not real, right? It's as long as he's not saying anything publicly, there's no public daylight between him and Biden, then it's fine. The U.S. can beg and plead and bang their fists on the table all they want in private. What does Netanyahu care? Netanyahu cares about one thing, and that is staying in power. And I think he was able to play Biden masterfully because he understood his weakness. His weakness was, it's much better for me to ask forgiveness than to ask for permission beforehand, right? So that's what he's done. Oh, I didn't tell you we were going to assassinate Hania. I'm sorry. I didn't tell you about these Hezbollah mass pager attacks. Sorry. But if they had asked for permission beforehand, they would have said no. They said, no, you can't do that. That's insane. It's not useful. It's certainly not helping our efforts to get a ceasefire. So Netanyahu knows this, and he knows that he can do whatever he wants because after the fact, I mean, literally, Biden has said, again, the muddled policy. Biden has said, we don't want to see a war between Israel and Hezbollah. We desperately want to prevent that from happening. But if it happens, we're going to support Israel unconditionally. So what do you hear if Netanyahu? All you hear is the second part, right? I don't care about that first part, or that you don't like it. I only care that you're going to support me when I do it. So that's all that matters.
I want to turn now to Hamas and the attacks of October 7th. And I'm interested in your perspective on what was Hamas's strategy in implementing that attack. What do you think they were hoping to get out of it? Has Israel, in many ways, I feel like Israel's response, especially initially, was pretty easy to anticipate and in my mind seemed to probably fit into what Hamas was looking for. Has Israel played into Hamas's hand the whole time? I mean, was this Hamas's strategy? Is this playing out more or less how Hamas had anticipated, and that's why they engaged in this?
That's like the million-dollar question, right? And that's not like we can ask Hamas leaders, what were you thinking? But we can try to extrapolate what they were thinking. I think it's pretty clear that Hamas's goal was to deliver an unprecedented shock to the Israeli system. And that obviously they achieved. Exactly what scale were they going for is a little bit more unclear. I think what we've heard even from Yahya Sinwar and others is the amount. Things didn't go according to plan on October 7th. So they had plans for a multifaceted attack by air, land, and sea. They broke through the fence. They had the paragliders. They had, and I think they were hoping to the 1,000 or so Hamas fighters who were participated in this attack, maybe less, because we know others who were not Hamas elements, in some cases, not even organized political or military units, but just random people. Like, once you blew a hole through the fence, then anyone could go through, and random people went in with their motorcycles and, in some cases, started kidnapping people themselves. So things, I think, got out of control on that day, but also they expected most of their fighters to be killed by Israeli police and army. But instead what happened is they were completely taken by surprise. the Hamas was able to overrun whole communities for hours before there was any kind of Israeli response. And that total collapse of the Israeli intelligence and security on that day, I think, was unanticipated. So Hamas was expecting much more resistance than they got, and so they ended up, instead of a couple dozen hostages, they ended up with 240. And I think there were people who were not necessarily, who may or may not have been part of Hamas, who just engaged in kind of a killing spree, you know, who for whatever reasons just decided this is the day that I'm just gonna, you know, murder people. And so I think it's safe to assume that the scale of the killing was greater than what Hamas had planned. And I think Yahya Sinwar has said as much. That said, at the end of the day, right, they're still responsible, right? They blew holes into the fence. They should have anticipated. You know, what they couldn't have anticipated is that the Israeli security forces would collapse so quickly. So I don't think they set out to kill 1,200 people or more. I think it was a more limited but still massive operation that through a combination of they lost control of it, and Israeli defenses broke down, became much bigger than it was initially planned to be. And so because I'm sure that I'm sure they knew that Israel would have a massively disproportionate response, but I doubt that they anticipated that the entirety of Gaza would be destroyed. I don't think they set out, I mean, clearly they knew that Israel would have a massive response unlike anything they'd ever seen because, this was unlike anything that had ever happened. But I don't think that they wanted to bring about the entire destruction and starvation of the Gaza Strip. So, but it's clear that they wanted to send a message that no, you're not safe. No, you were comfortable for all these years with the status quo, and we were not comfortable. Now you feel some of that pain. That was definitely part of the message to deliver that shock, but I think it was bigger than even they expected.
You know, I worry with this conflict that that all actors have become so ideologically driven that, I'm very pessimistic that we're going to see any kind of movement in the right direction anytime soon. I'd like you to comment a bit on maybe Hamas's ideology, because you critiqued the leadership in Israel, comparing some Israeli leaders to kind of having a KKK kind of mentality and that kind of level of racism involved in the Israeli leadership. Is Hamas's ideology similarly radical? And what kind of, I'm also interested in Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and obviously in the West Bank with Fatah, you have, I think, a more moderate leadership there than obviously for Hamas. But I'm interested in your views in terms of the Palestinian people and the types of ideologies that animate Palestinians. And all of this is really pointing towards the fact that, as you mentioned with ideas during the first part of your speech, that ideas are going to be what moves this forward ultimately. And so I'm really interested in hearing kind of how you look at Hamas and the Palestinians as well as the Israeli population.
Yeah, Hamas is an Islamist movement born out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has affiliates in a number of Arab countries. And in that sense, they are a mainstream Islamist movement, whatever that may mean, right? They're not, ideologically, despite the talking points in the early weeks of the war from Israel, they're not the same as ISIS. They're not the same as Al-Qaeda, right? They're not nihilists, right? They're not death and violence for their own sake, despite the atrocities that their people committed, clearly. But ideologically, they are like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I mean, they have the same ideology, so they don't recognize Israel or its right to exist, right? They refer to Israel as the Zionist entity. They don't think that Israel has moral legitimacy because it was established, in the Palestinian homeland through the expulsion of Palestinians. And that's not that may be radical to a lot of people here, but it's not radical to Palestinians. Palestinians also, by and large, don't accept Israel as I think this is a fundamental difference between, in the West, in the West, we take Israel's moral legitimacy for granted. Well, of course Israel has a right to exist. But if you're Palestinian, why does Israel have a right to exist when it came at my expense? That means that I don't have a right to have been there in the first place. And so they can't accept Israel's right to exist. So in that sense, Hamas ideologically is not all that radical in terms of Palestinian or even the broader Arab context. In the same way that most Israelis or Zionists would look at the West Bank and say, well, of course, this Judea and Samaria is part of the Jewish homeland. Even if some of us think we have to give it back and give it, to become a Palestinian state, it's still part of the Jewish patrimony. And so it's, what is radical in that sense? So Hamas is radical by our standards. And obviously, the attacks committed on October 7th are extreme and radical, and but I don't necessarily see a connection between Hamas's ideology and atrocities, right? Because you can be non-ideological and commit atrocities. You can be the U.S. Army and commit atrocities in Vietnam or in Iraq or. And so it's the whole notion of what is radical. I think people should be judged on the actions that they commit. If they commit atrocities, war crimes, they should be held to account. I don't think we should be judging people on the basis of their ideology. As long as the ideology itself isn't calling for genocide or, the destruction of people. Now, some people will argue that Hamas's ideology is genocidal. I don't believe that. I don't think Hamas espouses the elimination of all Jewish people. I think that's, there may be anti-Semitic elements, certainly in Hamas literature and Hamas's charter, but that's not the same thing, I think, as being genocidal. I think that's hyperbole.
Well, I mean, wouldn't it be safe to say, though, that Hamas's policy preference would be to ethnically cleanse the area of Jews? Is that correct or is that incorrect?
I'm not sure that I believe that, because through what means? I mean, first of all, what's the evidence that Hamas believes in the ethnic cleansing of Jews? Now, there's a point where people hedge, right? So they'll say Israel's not legitimate. That means the people, Israelis who are there shouldn't be there. And they believe that. But is that the same thing as saying they must all be expelled by force? I don't know that it is. I'm sure some Hamas people believe that. I'm not sure that it's part and parcel of Hamas's ideology. I think that's a stretch. That said, I mean, look, it also depends on who we're talking about. I mean, Hamas has different strands and different strains. The reality is that Hamas has, as a political movement, has accepted Israel's existence as a political reality, as a political and military reality, not as a moral one. And so you could even make a very compelling case, and in fact, I think it's more than compelling, that Hamas is inside the Palestinian consensus for a two-state solution. And that is not in the way Fatah and the PLO recognized, because as a condition, the PLO had to jump through these hoops that the Americans set. You have to recognize Israel's right to exist. The PLO read the script, literally, that they were handed by the Americans, and they said, sure, we'll say whatever we want because we can't be part of the peace process otherwise. Hamas says, no, we're not going to give the moral point, but we can live with a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. We accept that, with a long-term, indefinite truce with Israel. And so that is the official position of Hamas and has been under the leadership of Ahmed Yassin, who is the founder of Hamas, right up until Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated a few months ago. They're on the record as saying, we will accept a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, alongside Israel, even if they don't accept Israel morally.
I'm going to try to give some of the audience questions, give you a chance to answer some of the audience questions as well, Khaled. So I'm going to start with one from a student. We always try to do that. And I'm going to modify it slightly, but it's a great question even as it's written. It says, how do you feel social media has aided in public opinion, along with how it has played a part in getting information about the war to those in other countries? And I think maybe I would ask you also to juxtapose what you see in the American media as compared to social media and the messages that are coming out.
It's a really good question because the media plays an enormous role, and I will tell you that for the first many, many weeks after October 7th, the media did a horrible job of conveying the reality of what was happening. They ran with the crazy stories of the beheaded babies without any verification. I mean, to this day, I think President Biden is still talking about, atrocities that never happened, right? There were no beheaded babies. And yet people believe that, even the president still believes there are. The media was horribly irresponsible. The mainstream media was, I think, contributed to many of the atrocities that we see in Gaza. They gave it fuel and justification. I think they did a worse job than after 9/11, and I'm old enough to remember both. The level of dehumanization of Palestinians in the mainstream media was off the charts in October, November especially. I think anyone who was Palestinian felt that. I'm not Palestinian, but as an Arab, I felt it, and it felt personal. Like it was such madness in the media. In social media, I think social media has been absolutely essential to shifting the public narrative to the extent that it's shifted. And, there are polls before and after October 7th, and, we know that there are trends that are, that public opinion is shifting. Attitudes towards Palestinians and Israelis are changing. Less pro-Israel, generally speaking, less pro-Israel and more pro-Palestinian. It's especially true among younger people who are probably also the largest consumers of social media. What's the cause and effect? Is it because they're younger? Is it or because of the social media that's driving their opinions? So I think social media, because it's able to bypass the mainstream media gatekeepers, who for ideological and corporate reasons feel constrained to remain within a certain ideological lane, right? That there's a narrative about October 7th and pre-October 7th, right? There's a narrative about who the victims are and who isn't. And I think the mainstream media felt much more loyalty to that narrative, especially in America, compared to in Europe or elsewhere. And the miracle of social media is that it's unfiltered. It doesn't go through editors or producers and the traditional gatekeepers of the corporate media. And so people can get raw material. Now, the downside is that it's raw material, right? You don't have context. You just have footage of some horrible thing happening. But who did it? Who's doing the shooting? Who's doing the dying? What happened just before and just after that clip? We're missing that part. So there is an upside and a downside to the social media phenomenon. But I think the democratization of the media through social media is really important and has been a lifeline for Palestinians in Gaza because they get to tell their stories directly to the world. Not even through their own leaders, right? Because their leaders are kind of worthless, right? The PLO or the PA, and I mean, who are these people? What are they doing? And so people like Mu'taz and Bisan, who become like almost household names because of their daily reportage on Gaza, from the standpoint of people there, I think has really swayed people.
Okay, thank you. This is another one that is from a student. What would you have considered an appropriate measured response from Israel to October 7th?
An appropriate measured response would have been to go after the people who actually carried out the attack. But that would require knowing who carried out the attack, and we know that there were intelligence failures. So, I mean, I think, you know, there are a number of, I mean, Israel has the intelligence capability, even if there were catastrophic failures on that day. We know that they can reach a Hezbollah commander in his apartment in downtown Beirut in a very precision way. They can target him. They targeted Ismail Haniyeh in the capital of Iran, right, under the very noses of the Iranian regime, right? And he's in a guest house, presumably, you know, a presidential guest house that's secure. So they could reach him there with pinpoint accuracy. But in Gaza, for some reason, they have to destroy the whole neighborhood in order to kill one Hamas guy. It's just not reasonable. So the premise of the question itself assumes that somehow we've racked our brains, you know, we're really struggling and there's just no other option, right? There's 100 other options before you get to the total annihilation of a society, right? So I'm not a military person. I'm not a person who can speak fluently about operational and tactical and military, you know, that sort of thing, right? But we know that what Israel is doing now is not that, is not targeted. In fact, the Israeli leaders said from the beginning, and I'm quoting, "Our mission is about destruction, not precision," okay? Their aim is to punish because they believe in the collective guilt of Palestinians in Gaza. And I hear it all the time. Sometimes they will let it leak. They voted for Hamas. Okay. First of all, most of Gaza wasn't alive when Hamas was elected in 2006 because they're, you know, mostly like under the age of 20. So they didn't actually vote for Hamas. At least the people who are doing all the dying now, they didn't vote for Hamas. But even if they did, even if every single person in Gaza is a card-carrying member of Hamas, is that a justification to kill them all? I mean, come on. Like, we have to have rules. We have to have reason. And so we make distinctions. So, you know, what should Israel have done? They should abide by international humanitarian law. The two principles of international law. It's not up to me to decide how they abide by those principles. I'll let the generals and the lawyers decide how do we abide operationally by international law, but there are two principles. One is distinction, distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. This is a guy with a gun, he's trying to attack me, or this is a guy planning an attack, I can target him, or their weapons, or whatever, and these people are not, right? And the second principle is proportionality. The threat that is posed by this person with the gun, if I attack him, are the costs to non-combatants proportional to the threat that this person poses to me? We've seen cases, instances where in a single strike, because they were going after one guy, they will kill more than 100 civilians. Is that proportional? Of course it's not proportional. It's not even reasonable. So what should Israel do? Israel should abide by the most fundamental principles of distinction and proportionality, which they are clearly not doing.
Okay, I'm going to, because we only have time for one more question. For all of those of you that asked Khaled about what would happen if we had a Trump or a Harris administration, I am not ignoring the question, but you would be asking him to ask a hypothetical. If he wants to address it, that's fine, but I'm going to put a different question to him, because he made a very powerful point about the number of casualties that were taking place in Gaza, the number of civilian casualties. And the second point that he made, and this is all encapsulated in a question that the questioner made, is about the fact that Hamas is not only a physical presence, it's an idea. So for Khaled, if we're seeing all these civilian casualties, and is in fact the policy that Israel is embarking on in danger with all of these young people of creating within a half generation Hamas 2.0?
That's the question. Yeah, I mean, look, what I fear for Gaza, when you look at what's been done, the mass starvation, the mass trauma, right? So just imagine for every day for a year, you don't know if you're going to wake up because you're going to be bombed. You don't know if you're safe. You don't know if your children are safe. You may not know if your family on the other side of Gaza is even alive. You know that everything that you've ever known has been destroyed, been wiped off the earth. The trauma of seeing people blown to bits on a daily basis, the suffering this is exactly the conditions. In addition to the fact that now Gaza is you've now destroyed the governing authority, right? So there's no law and order. There's basic breakdown in the social fabric. This is exactly the kind of ingredients that go into creating that radicalizes a generation. So we're looking at the next generation that is likely to, frankly, I'm not worried about Hamas 2.0. I'm worried about something that is far more radical than Hamas, that we're going to look back at and say, whoa, Hamas, those were the good old days. At least you could talk to Hamas. But we're going to get something far worse, because look at the conditions that have been created. Gaza is now unlivable and ungovernable. How does anyone imagine that this scale of death and destruction will make Israelis safe? I promise you it won't. I promise you Israelis will be less safe in the future than they are now. I hate to say that, but I know in my heart it's true, because you can't create this kind of immiseration and suffering without someone out there saying, I need to get retribution. My parents were all killed. My whole family was killed. When that person grows up, they're going to get retribution. I'm much more worried about things that are far worse than Hamas.
Okay, well, thank you, Khaled. Before we stop, though, I think one more question. I'm going to put one more question to you. We've got a lot of young people out here. Do you have any suggestions for what we should do?
You know, my answer to this question is from where I'm sitting, the young people are actually leading the way. So I'm not in a position to tell people Like, you guys are teaching us how to change, because clearly we failed. My generation, we failed. I worked on the peace process for many years. We tried to negotiate a two-state solution. We failed. And so, you know, I look to the younger generation actually to lead the way.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Okay, for all of you, if you wish to buy one of Khaled's books, they're out in the back to the right as you exit. But before you leave, a couple quick reminders. Tomorrow night, yes, tomorrow, back-to-back, doubleheader, we have Fiona Hill coming to this auditorium. Fiona is recognized as one of the world's foremost experts on Ukraine, Russia, and especially Vladimir Putin. It's going to be an exceptional event. On October 3rd, we're partnering with the Old Art Building in Leland, Michigan. We'll be hosting Chris Elstoff, Consul General of Australia. He's going to address security, economic, and climate issues in the Indo-Pacific. There won't be an online option. I'm sorry if you're online out there, this one won't have an online option. This is an in-person only event, and tickets are required. To buy them, you need to go to the IAF website. 9 October, we return to global migration and the southern border. Our in-person speaker is Alan Burson, former Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, and our remote speaker will be Andrew Seeley, President of the Migration Policy Institute. IAF is a member-driven organization. If you like what you heard tonight, we'd ask you to join if you haven't already, and you can talk to one of our board members. So as you make your way home tonight, drive carefully. In the days that follow, go forth and do great things. Thank you very much.